Welcome back, U.S. history students. Here we are still early in our semester, and this is our second presentation. The first was fairly specific. We were just talking about Christopher Columbus, although what we end with is a pretty big principle in history, just the fact that history is an interpretation of events over time. And we know that there's been a lot of very different interpretations of Christopher Columbus. Doesn't change what actually happened, but how people feel about it or how they are going to interpret the motives, the what is most important about it. Those things constantly change. Well, this second presentation is a bit different because we're going to be covering quite a bit more ground here. I've just called this a Spanish and French colonies, and this is my attempt to go through several significant explorers um, from early 1500s. Some will even get all the way to the 1700s here. So this really is breezing through a couple of centuries of exploration. But part of what I'm trying to do here is just a introduce you to or highlight some of the figures that you're going to be reading about that are important Spanish and French um, explorers and the kinds of colonies they set up. And B, this is so that we can make an easier contrast between the Spanish, the French, and later the English colonies, which we'll spend quite a bit more time on. So let's begin looking at some of the significant Spanish explorers who I'm going to want you to know as this semester progresses. Now, this is after the time of Columbus, and of course, lots of other explorers came on the heels of Columbus. And for the 15 teens, the Caribbean was still really the headquarters of Spanish in the New World. But then someone took an expedition inland onto the mainland and inland. And one of those that you really need to know is Hernan Cortez. Um, Cortez comes from the islands um, into central Mexico now and ends up fighting against the Aztecs, this really large Indian civilization, which was quite advanced. It was not like the first primitive natives that Christopher Columbus found, who knew nothing about metal tools and things like that. The Aztecs had quite a sophisticated civilization with large cities and um, and in some ways were more advanced than the Spanish had been. Now, not not in all the ways of war and not in all tools. That's going to be a great advantage to Cortez. But Cortez actually was not in charge in the islands. He sort of takes this expedition on by himself. Didn't really have the governor's permission, but he hears about this place of great wealth, and so he wants a name for himself. He's going to take his men, and about 400 men, they come ashore, and they're going to start um, moving their way toward central Mexico. But the governor back in the Caribbean was not happy that he has kind of taken this on by himself and is going to try to gain gold and glory for himself. So the governor actually sends somebody else to stop him. So before Cortez actually launches this conquest of the Aztecs, he has to fight off another Spanish force. And we'll get to that individual in just a little bit. Um, but it's quite an adventure here. Cortez defeats his rival and moves on, does fight some native tribes on the way to central Mexico, but mainly what he's finding out is there's a lot of other people in central Mexico that hate the Aztecs, that fear them, and resent that the Aztecs use them for labor or for human sacrifice. So if you're wondering how does Cortez take 400 men and conquer a whole civilization that is hundreds of thousands of people. How does he take this city of Tenochtitlan That's what will become Mexico City. Well, one of the main ways he does that is by using the other natives around him that also want to see the Aztecs fall. Now, having better weapons, that helps too. And just the mystery of these men, these pale skinned Spaniards who come ashore from a distant place, it's mesmerizing to even to an advanced civilization like the Aztecs to have no idea where these people have come from. It is like two alien worlds have come together. Um, so Cortez, that's my very short version of Cortez conquering the Aztecs. Now, the person that was sent after Cortez, person that was supposed to stop him, was Panfilio de Narvaez. And Narvaez is sent on another expedition, an ill-fated expedition, which is going to end up being the Cabeza de Vaca expedition. Here's the story. Narvaez, also starting down here in the islands in Cuba, comes up into Florida where he was going to explore. And he, you know, this is not the first time that the Spaniards had come to Florida. There have been other expeditions in the area that were skipping over, Ponce de Leon and others. So natives in Florida have already had some negative encounters with the Spanish. They're not ready to listen to them or exchange pleasantries. They're ready to fight. So Narvaez makes some poor decisions here as a leader by leaving the ships, here on the Gulf Coast around Central Florida and just kind of moving inland and telling the ships, go ahead and go up the coast and we'll meet you further that direction. Well, Narvaez and the expedition will come under attack from various native tribes, and they're never going to find those ships again. Um, Ships go uh, back to Cuba, and Narvaez and his men were now stranded. But one of the men with him, a man that felt compelled to come with him, is Cabeza de Vaca, and he is sort of the treasurer on this trip. He's got to keep up with the expenses and the money and know that every dime is accounted for. Well, kind of being stranded now in a hostile area, Narvaez decides they need to fashion some boats, create rafts, and then travel together along the coast. He does know geography well enough to know that, well, the Spanish have possession of land over here on the other side of this water. So if they can find a way just to skirt the coast and get to Mexico, that's where his rival Cortez has already made this conquest in 1520. This is now about 1528. But this expedition falls apart because those rafts fall apart. Now they're not going to try to sail a raft, across the deep blue sea here. They're trying to just hug the coast, but tides would pull the rafts further out, and they couldn't really keep all five rafts tied together. At one point, Narvaez just says, "Every man for himself. Every raft. Don't try to keep up with the others." Well, most of these men, they're going to drown. Um, some along this part of the Gulf Coast, many more along the Texas Gulf Coast. And Cabeza de Vaca is just one of the few survivors of this expedition. He and three other friends end up being saved and adopted by some native tribes on the coast of southern Texas. Now, I say saved because they have survived this expedition, but now they'll at least get something to eat when they're among these tribes. But it's a hard life, very harsh existence. Um, One of the things that saves Cabeza de Vaca and his other friends is that the natives believe they have special powers to heal, medical powers. Well, one of them did have a little bit of education about anatomy. He wasn't really a doctor, but he he could know something about health, and mainly just these Catholic Spaniards. They're praying, give some Hail Marys and hope that things are going to hope that natives are going to get better when they're treated. And apparently it works sometimes, enough to where the native population thinks these people are healers. They're special, but they're still slaves among the natives, and these are very primitive natives. Some of those along the coast of the Gulf Coast of Texas, where they ended up, um, had very hard lives. Um, you one of the tribes that Cabeza de Vaca describes, you know, filled their stomach with tree bark and stones sometimes, just have dirt, just something to put in your belly. Um, very, very difficult lives. Well, he and these other friends make connections now when they realize, oh, some of my fellow Spaniards have survived too, and they're just scattered to these um, different small tribes. But they would come together at an annual root digging um, festival. I don't know, much of a festival, but every year tribes would come and harvest these roots and just get bloated from eating these gassy roots. And they plan an escape. Next year when we're here, let's get away. So that's what they did. And Cabeza de Vaca and friends will head through the rest of Texas and end up in Mexico, but they sort of move west across northern Mexico, and again meeting lots and lots of different tribes. Now, this is part of what is significant why I'm highlighting Cabeza de Vaca. He's not your typical conquistador because he's not conquering anything. In fact, a good book about him calls him a barefoot conquistador. He's been humbled. He certainly believes in Spanish superiority to these native people, but he, more than most, he's going to see them in a very human way because his life has depended on them often. And he's really treated pretty well among a lot of different tribes, but he's going to describe their very strange ways too. Um, and so a lot of what he gathers, what he writes about, is going to be some of our firsthand sources of what were natives' lives like in the 1520s. Well, he and his friends get a big following. A lot of um, Indians follow them again because they think of them as healers, special medicine men. But they do finally run into other Spaniards who are hunting for slaves in this area of Mexico. And Cabeza de Vaca is very uncomfortable with that. He doesn't want to enslave the native population, especially those that have been following him and who have taken care of him. But that's what he's going to encounter other Spaniards on slave hunting expeditions. And meeting up with them, he'll end up coming down to Mexico City, and and he'll have lots of stories to share. And one of those is talking about what he constantly hears from other tribes, that there could be cities of gold out there. Um, well, that definitely gets people's attention, and it's actually going to lead to a couple of other expeditions. Real briefly, um, the expedition of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. Coronado searches the southwest for these cities of gold, and Hernando de Soto is going to search the southeast. Now, Coronado is following up on some of the rumor that Cabeza de Vaca has shared. And one of the travelers with Cabeza de Vaca was a African named uh, Esteban. Um, and he travels with a Spanish priest out in this area, and Esteban is killed. But the priest, Friar Marcos, comes back and says, I've seen these cities of gold. Now, not sure if he's just making up stories or if he genuinely thought he saw cities of gold. Maybe he was looking at Pueblo villages and with the way the sun hit off the side, he thought it's gold. But he didn't go any further because Esteban had already gone and irritated people enough to get himself killed. So Coronado is going to go into this area, and not just him, but a large number of people go with Coronado and search all over the Southwest. That one group will find the Grand Canyon. They'll be cutting through the panhandle of Texas and into New Mexico, with present day New Mexico, and um, and some guides there will say, we know how to get you to these cities of gold. And this guide later admits he wanted to just lead him out in the middle of nowhere, hoping Coronado and his people would get lost and die. Now, they don't appreciate this guy doing that. He's going to pay for that with his life. But this is why the route just shows them going up into present day Kansas and kind of turning around. They're just kind of going out into the Great Plains where there is nothing to help guide you. It's just a sea of grass. And so very, very few landmarks where you could say, when you get to that hill, that very distinct mountain there, you know where you are. So Coronado's expedition was a failure, but along the way he does uh, encounter and have negative encounters with a lot of Pueblo Indians in the Southwest. Now, Cabeza de Vaca would love to have been the guy to lead a southeastern expedition again. Remember, he's on this Narvaez expedition that already traveled the coast. But he wasn't chosen to lead that one. Instead, Hernando de Soto, um, a veteran of another large expedition down in South America, was chosen. Cortez is the man who leads the conquest of the Aztecs, and a man named Francisco Pizarro leads the conquest of the Incas in South America. Well, De Soto was part of that expedition to defeat the Incas, and he will mimic many of the same things he saw there. What Pizarro would do is they would capture, a local chief and say, we're going to kill the chief if you don't give us all the gold that we ask for. And, so De Soto kind of follows that same pattern of using the threat of violence to a tribe's chief until they give everything that the Spanish demand. And then even then, they may still execute the leader. Well, De Soto does that through the southeast, through this red line kind of shows you where he went. Georgia and some of the Carolinas, and searching all over, still looking for wealth. And a lot of times they do gain some wealth by grabbing a chief, insisting people give gold, but nothing like what the Aztecs and the Incas had. De Soto is not really pulling in tons and tons of gold and silver like he expected to. Now his group will find the Mississippi River, so the Spanish will make some claim there. And De Soto actually dies on this expedition, and he'll be buried um, uh, near the Mississippi River. But his people want to make sure that it's a secret burial, because some of the Indians have kind of looked at these men as such mysterious figures. They don't want them to know they're really just human. They can die too. But they constantly had fights with various native tribes all along the southeast. Okay, so this is all very just quick snapshots of some of these significant explorers in the 1520s and 30s, early 1540s when we get to Coronado and De Soto as well. Now, the Spanish tended to govern these lands that they have claimed, very differently than what the French and the English will do. They set up missions like the one you see here. This is a picture of mine taken in San Antonio. There's not just the Alamo in San Antonio. There's actually a series of 4 missions that are part of a national park now. And so here's the first of those missions. You come to just a few miles down the road from the Alamo, but much less visited here. So Texans, you have no excuse. You can go visit um, these old missions still in San Antonio. Um, well, the Spanish tended to set up these kinds of missions and welcome Indians to come and live within the walls here, where they would be taught Christianity, um, and um, and they would labor for the Spanish as well. Um, Now, some tribes, if they are really picked on by other stronger tribes, they may want the protection of the Spanish. They may be more willing to convert and live among the Spanish. Other powerful tribes are not so thrilled to have the Spanish around. They'll constantly be at war with them. But in New Spain, the king of Spain or queen or both, um, whoever happens to be on the throne, they would appoint uh, a viceroy, one over New Spain, one over Peru. That was the South American part. And those viceroys would hand power down to local governors. It was a very hierarchical kind of system, uh, very organized, stair stepping up to the top. And again, interactions with Native Americans, there's lots of war, but for those that will convert and live within the mission system, they'll have the protection of the Spanish. Now, besides some of the places that I've shown, of course, the Spanish had possession in Florida. They'd have other similar missions like this built in Florida as well. Not many still as well preserved as these from San Antonio. They'd be making the same kinds of missions in New Mexico. Um, they would establish those, especially in Santa Fe, one of their earliest settlements there in New Mexico. Juan de Oñete is in some ways one of their latter conquistadors. You can see he's coming at the end of the century. Um, he's coming several decades after those others that I've mentioned here today. But Oñete would be the one who, in some ways, traces the steps of where Coronado had gone. Um, but if anything, he is even more brutal to the local Indians there for not supporting him. Um, and so, for those that fight against him, he would make sure they're punished in a way that they wouldn't forget, having every man's right foot chopped off. Um, and so, um, conquistadors could be pretty brutal, um, but they're often leading these expeditions kind of on their own money. And of course, they're hoping to make money on whatever they find or whatever wealth they can extract from the native population, too. Now, jump ahead almost a century here. Oñete helps establish a city there in Santa Fe, but the Pueblo Indians will revolt. When more of them are getting ill, they will blame the Spaniards and say, this is illness brought from these outsiders, and they've taught us strange religion. We used to worship these gods of nature and think of multiple gods, corn mothers and things like that. And now this whole idea of Christianity has changed things. So Pueblo Indians led this enormous revolt in 1680, and it drove the Spaniards out of New Mexico, at least temporarily. They were back just in a few years and in a stronger way. But there definitely was a sign here. Pueblos are not all that thrilled all the time to have the Spaniards bring their culture into the land. Now, again, jumping ahead even more decades, um, the Spanish will make a bunch of missions in California as well. Most famous mission builder there, Junipero Serra, or Father Serra. And I didn't post pictures here, but I have been to a few of these missions, really stretching from San Diego up to San Francisco. There's just a series of 20 something missions. Um, Santa Barbara is one of the best preserved. He's buried, Father Sarah is buried actually in one in Carmel. So, really interesting historic sites that you can still go see. But he was living in um, the mid 1700s. So, we're talking about things that are happening around the time of the American Revolution back east. The Spanish were still making um, further settlements in California. Now, let me switch to another group real quickly. We won't say as much individually about all these guys, but I do want you to know a few of these French explorers as well. Uh, First of all, Giovanni Verrazzano. Uh, Verrazzano was not French. He's an Italian, but he does sail in the name of France. You can see him coming into uh, the coast of what is north in now the east coast of the United States. Verrazzano does come up the coast, and he doesn't actually go into, um, go into present day New York, but he's in that area, um, and he'll make a return trip. This is pretty early 1500s, 1520s. He's actually killed on a second trip because um, he he goes ashore to visit Indians, and his ship is still, has to be deeper out in the ocean where it won't get grounded. And the Indians there just lure him in and then uh, kill him to feast on him. The ship is still too far out to actually launch cannons or anything to try to drive the Indians back. Plus, Giovanni would be right there in the way, but they were sort of helpless. Here their captain is just being killed and cannibalized right there. But Verrazano was early important explorer along the coast, the east coast of what is now United States. But the Frenchman who really makes more contact in what would end up being French territory is Jacques Cartier. Through three different expeditions, all of which survive and do well, Cartier travels this area, goes through the St. Lawrence River, and um, finds places like Quebec and Montreal, places that had been Indian villages before. And he's establishing um, trading relations with these Native Americans. Um, we won't take the time to say much more about Cartier, but very interesting, um, fantastic tales that he hears from some of the natives that he ends up encountering, and some that he takes back to France as well. But as far as having successful uh, missions and those that he and his crew survive, Cartier is one of the most successful of any of these. Now, Samuel de Champlain will be even more significant as establishing more permanent French settlements in Quebec and Montreal, um, and really establishing close relations with some native tribes there. Champlain gets involved in some local tribal wars. He didn't create the tribal war. There were already constant wars between the Iroquois people of what would be modern day New York. The Iroquois were um, a tribe really of five different nations come together and uniting in this one group called the Iroquois. But the people that Champlain was closer to were the Huron Indians. So there's constant fighting between Hurons and Iroquois. And Cartier is going to try to befriend those Hurons. Uh, I'm sorry, I've said Cartier, I mean Champlain. Champlain wants the friendship of these Huron Indians, so he brings guns, and he's going to show them this is what a rifle can do. Well, it's an old something from early 1600s, still pretty primitive, but you know, it scares people. It's a fire stick. It blows fire out the end, and it makes a warrior even more powerful. You can kill some people with it. It's still slow to reload, but Champlain can show the Hurons how to use it, and the next time they fight the Iroquois, they win. And that does set off a dangerous pattern here. Again, the Iroquois and Huron, they were already fighting. Um, Champlain didn't start that, but he does um, introduce a more destructive weapon to both of them. Uh, by the way, the Dutch are going to be helping and aligning with the Iroquois, and those wars get bigger as they get better armed, and they've got two different European powers on opposing sides. This animosity that was already there becomes much more significant. Marquette and Joliet, or if you can say, you might like Joliet, so it rhymes with Marquette. Um, this is a pair, um, a priest, Marquette, and um, just an adventurer, Joliet. They travel the Great Lakes and they end up coming down the Mississippi River. Told you, Spanish had already found it back in the 1530s with De Soto, but now the French are actually going to be traveling much further down the whole stretch of the Mississippi. They don't actually go all the way because they hear from other natives that the Spanish are down here and they don't want that confrontation. So Marquette and Joliet make their way back north. Um, Unfortunately, they're going to have a boat overturned and lose many of the documents to history that would have detailed more about their trip. Um, Father Marquette, by the way, is a missionary who establishes um, um, several mission points around the Great Lakes. Um, so these would be French Catholics, um, you know, and but they're still going to be in rivalry the with the Spanish, even though both are Catholic. They've got national differences, which would put them at odds with one another. Um, and let's see, I think I've got another one on here. Robert LaSalle. Um, LaSalle travels the entire length of the Mississippi. And so the French are going to be claiming the Mississippi and everything that runs into it. Of course, everything between the Appalachian Mountains here and the Rocky Mountains here, everything drains to the Mississippi. So the French are claiming a humongous area. They don't even know what all they're claiming. And they certainly don't have settlers in all those places. Their settlers are mainly along the St. Lawrence River and around the Great Lakes, but they're claiming everything in the Mississippi. Now, LaSalle, once he makes that voyage down the Mississippi, goes back home, comes back hoping to find the Mississippi again, but he overshoots it. Um, he had the line of latitude right. He just forgot the longitude or didn't hit that just right. So he ends up on the coast of Texas. This is why when you see there are six flags over Texas, you see this French flag. There was not a long-standing French presence in Texas, but for a little while, thanks to Robert LaSalle, there was a French presence in Texas. And the Spanish weren't happy about it. They were, when they heard rumors that here's this other European group, Spanish were coming to drive them out. But LaSalle and his men actually leave and were heading back toward the Mississippi when LaSalle's killed by one of his own men, mutiny among the men. So, um, a different fate than most explorers. But this is why you see this French flag over Texas ever so briefly and never exactly over all of Texas. They just had a landing there. Well, just to wrap things up, I want to point out a couple of things. We'll make contrast with the English later on, but let me just point out a couple of things that um, illustrate the complications of this contact between Europeans and Native Americans. We talk a lot about Columbian exchange, Columbus coming to the New World, and he's going to bring new uh, ideas and systems, um, and in some cases, bringing disease as well that's going to have a huge impact on the Americas. Um, and over time, the Spaniards and the French, they will be taking back to the old world many of the things that they find in the new. And there's this whole exchange of germs and and goods and ideas. But it's not simply a one-way contact. It's not something that all of this contact has devastated all of the Americas and only enriched the Europeans. It's much more complicated than that. Um, the contact between the two definitely shapes each society. There's no question about that. But it changes some things about each of them, and um, it gives certain advantages to different groups. Here, horses is a great example. Um, the Native Americans didn't have horses, so horse culture that's going to develop among Indians of the Great Plains, that comes because the Spanish brought horses. And many of their horses got away and they just run wild on the Great Plains. And over time, they multiply and they become great herds of horses. Well, that changed the way of life for many Native Americans in that region. Some took to the horse this new, this new potential uh, technology, a new means of travel and war. Some Native Americans took to that new advantage very well, and others did not. Um, some tribes, like the Comanche in the southern plains, they weren't so significant of a tribe before. They were kind of smaller, shorter people, but they were unrivaled in how good they could become on horseback, how good they could become at breeding horses, taking other people's horses, and becoming a dominant force in the southern plains. Um, so the Comanches rose to a commanding position in some ways because of the contact with the Spanish. Now, again, we're talking over a couple of hundred years. So imagine Spaniards have come to the New World, and in the early 1500s, horses are getting loose. But by the 1700s, some tribes are going to be more powerful than they ever were before because of horse culture. And other tribes who were more powerful earlier, if they don't adopt to these new ways, well, they may get left behind. They may be wondering how did the Comanche and the Cheyenne and the Sioux and the Apache, how did they become so powerful? Well, some of it's this complications of contact and acquiring horses. A little while ago, I already mentioned this, that the French, um, the French fighting on the side of the Huron, the Dutch fighting on the side of the Iroquois could complicate wars. But imagine this too: both of those tribes, Huron and Iroquois, large tribes, um, they already hunted uh, beaver, otter, things that you could skin and make warm, um, warm hats from, things like that. Used all beaver skins for all kinds of things. Well, they didn't need Europeans to help teach them how to do that or create a market for it. But when the French see these beaver and otter pelts and and start taking those back to Europe and see how much money can be made from these things, there is much more incentive to hunt these kinds of animals. Um, again, the natives of the Northeast already hunted these kind of animals, but with the French fur trade and the Dutch fur trade really competing against one another, now all of their their native allies have an incentive to hunt them more than they've ever done before. Not just what you can use, but so much that, until Europeans get tired of buying them, hunt them almost to extinction if you can, because there's more money in it. And again, there's already war between these native populations. Now it's it's also a great commercial war, and it's a war of empire because the French are going to be depending on this trade with Native Americans. The Dutch are depending on trade with their Native Americans, um, and it changes the relationship between different tribes. They were already at war. Now it just becomes much more intense. It's not as much about just occasional go and pillage the other guys, kill a few of their people, and have good stories to tell. Now there's much more incentive to go wipe out that other group if you can, because they're trying to trap all the animals we're trying to trap too. Okay, so just a couple of illustrations that when we talk about this exchange between Europeans and Native Americans, it's not as simple as just seeing a one-way change, or that all Native Americans became losers in this exchange. Some tribes will rise, some tribes will fall. All will be changed because of the contact. Okay, that's all for now. We'll have more on similar topics, looking especially at English colonies very soon. See you then.